speakers of the series here. Today we have the term's first professional development event, and we're really excited to have a great group of speakers with us today. And we're going to be talking about harnessing our academic training to be more effective in doing work in the public interest. So there's a lot of us that have worked hard to gain all of these research and academic skills, but there are fortunately fewer of us going into hard academics. So there's a lot of opportunity to use those skills in potentially interesting and productive ways. And our speakers today have definitely been doing that. So I'm hopeful that we can cultivate an interesting discussion and then turn over later in the talk to you all to have some Q&A. So we're joined today by Sophia Murphy, Kirsten Bales, and Connor Reynolds. They're working across topics including food security, socially responsible resource development, and air quality and climate change mitigation. So please join me in welcoming our speakers. So I'd like to invite each of you to give a quick introduction to your work and background, if you would like.
Hi, I'm Sophia. I'm an IRES fourth year PhD student who lives in Squamish, so doesn't spend as much time here as she would like to. My academic background, I was born in Britain and we moved a lot when I was growing up, but I ended up doing my university work in the UK a long time ago. And came out with a master's degree and went to work in Ottawa at the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, which is an organization that brings together the development NGOs, non-government organizations in Canada. And they were coordinating policy work for the nonprofit sector in development, and it was a fairly newish thing to start to shift. There was already been solidarity work that had gone on, especially around apartheid, to some extent around military governments in Central America and the way the violence was spilling over into civil life there. But it was newish for NGOs at the time, so this is 1990, to begin to be conscious about having a policy aspect to their work and not just going to a country and meeting partners and starting to do practical program things. And so I started there. I did work in India separately and learned a lot from it, but I never did that kind of out in the field work. I was always in this policy advocacy area. And I spent 20 years there before I came to the university. And I came to do the PhD for different reasons. Partly we were new in BC and I wanted to meet people and get a sense of what the work here could be like. It was new for me. I didn't know this part of Canada at all. But I also think that it's always what had motivated me to try and work out what was causing problems. I was interested in what Canada did that was affecting the possibilities for developing countries elsewhere. So what was our trade policy doing? How effective was our aid policy? Were we undermining? Were we creating one possibility by sending assistance and then undermining that by our trade structures or by at the time, international debt was a big issue, and the fact that a lot of developing countries were putting all their public resources into repaying debts for purchases that the people in those countries had very little say in agreeing to or determining. So I think the importance of research will come through in the discussion. I think that a lot of advocacy campaigns need better information and need better evidence, but they need lots of other things as well. And so you see a tension arises around timelines, around what you want to do with evidence and what it's for. And I think it's interesting to look at where the circles overlap and to understand how probably most of what goes on in both worlds is different and for different reasons. And then taking advantage of the synergy that helps to understand where that synergy exists, I think, and that can be difficult to pinpoint.
Thank you. I was really pleased to be invited here today because I think a lot of my own work focuses predominantly on the science policy interface. And so my background, I'm sort of classically trained as a plant ecologist and environmental chemist, but a lot of the work that I've done in terms of transboundary water conflicts and other sorts of work in developing countries, I had the opportunity and the privilege, I think, of liaising with many scientists in developing countries as well as decision makers, and very quickly recognized that, of course, there's usually potentially dysfunctional communication between the scientific experts and those that support decision making and policy making. So before I arrived to UBC as a doctoral fellow in forest science, which I'm currently on a one-year sabbatical for, I had worked and lived in places like Nepal, Mongolia, Nigeria, and some parts in Eastern Africa as well when I was working for a specialized technical agency within the UN system. And something I did find very interesting there was a lot of the work that they did was extremely technical, but that it provided a very important conduit to support evidence-based decision-making in developing countries to a broad spectrum of sustainable development issues. So predominantly the work that I've done is on natural resource governance in fragile and conflict-affected states. And although in my previous tenure before I returned to Canada, I was usually working on behalf of developing countries directly. When I came back to UBC, there's an institute that was formed here 3 years ago by Global Affairs Canada that focuses on, I would say, a very complex and political issue of looking at Canada's contribution to the extractive sector in developing countries and our potential to be a driving force for poverty alleviation. Because all of Canadian and overseas development assistance must be linked to human rights and poverty alleviation, but previously in terms of looking at natural resource government regimes and particularly looking at the conflict issues that arise around mining and conflict minerals, which is my specialty, is something that I felt a unique privilege to actually work on behalf of my own government for Canada at looking at some of these complex spaces. So I can provide more information specifically about the Institute, but I think one reason why it's so salient for the topic of conversation today is that we are the intersection between research and international development assistance, which is kind of a new space, I think, and that the Institute formed here, all of the applied research that we create is actually designed for public policy relevance. So I look forward to discussing that and answering your questions.
Okay, thanks. So my name's Connor. I was based in this building between around 2005 and 2010, and had a lot of fun here, sat in those chairs for a lot of sessions, and had my mind significantly opened from the time that I started to the time that I finished, and it definitely took me on a path that has been really rewarding career-wise. So hopefully I can share, some of my experiences so far. So I was born in Victoria, despite my still remaining accent, and I did my undergrad in engineering in Dublin, in Ireland, where I grew up. My parents moved back there when I was very little. And so when I was looking for an opportunity to do a master's, it seemed pretty obvious that I should try and use this Canadian passport that was burning a hole in my pocket. And I looked at various different places to go, and the West Coast seemed pretty good. So I came to do a master's in engineering. It was very technical. The walls are pretty high around the engineering department. There isn't a huge amount of interaction with other activities on campus, so I was very open to understanding the work that I was doing, which was about emissions from engines and impact on health and climate, kind of peripherally, because I was mostly in the lab tweaking an engine. Subsequently, I got the opportunity through working as a research engineer at UBC to meet more people who are doing, I guess I would say, science policy interface is a really interesting space, and I think an applied science policy interface was where I kind of started to think about, okay, so we've got these emissions from the way we use energy, and they have impacts, whether that's climate or health. And so I was fortunate to meet various people who work at IRES, faculty at IRES, and other places in the university, which was very interesting to me. It was an opportunity to say, here's this technical stuff I'm doing, this is good knowledge, it would be interesting, but wow, would it be way more interesting to look at this interface with how the use of technologies, energy technologies, impacts people. And so getting into that policy, people, society space was the huge reward I had from working here at IRES. So after doing a postdoc, which was again in that same kind of space, I had a real interest in energy use in developing countries and the impact of energy use, so I can tell you more about that if you're interested. An opportunity came up to work with Metro Vancouver, which is the regional government, and it's an often newspaper that you pick up for free. So, it's an unfortunate coincidence of name. So, this is kind of like a under the radar local government in our jurisdiction, right? It's a big utility provider. They're behind the clean water that you drink and the waste that gets disposed of responsibly and the wastewater that's treated. And there's a big regional planning function. There's an air quality and climate change group, which I'm part of. And it's a very much, although it has kind of conservative, traditional government elements, it is a very innovative in some ways and a very evidence-driven organization when it comes to policy and regulation. So it's turned out to be a really good space for me to be based in. I feel like it's something I can make a contribution in, and so I look forward to questions and talk more about that.
Great, thanks, Lo. Obviously, you all are doing really interesting work at this kind of science policy interface, and the science policy interface is something we always talk about in departments like this, but I think we're really fortunate today to have a set of panelists who actually have a ton of experience doing that. So I'd like to ask each of you if you could describe maybe a particular project with a particular organization where you were really, in practice, applying your research and academic background to do and to advance what those actually look like.
I mean, I came at it backwards, right? I did a lot of public policy advocacy by looking desperately for evidence where it existed and testing that evidence against my experience and the experience of the people I was working with. And I've come to a PhD partly to have a more satisfactory experience of the science part, because it's a constant limitation on you in public policy that people want answers, and very often people know what they want before they come to you and ask for the evidence. And so that's true of nonprofits, it's true of governments, it's certainly true of ministers. So part of what's fascinating about it, but part of what's challenging about it is that how do you make space to be giving good answers? Once policies are in place, they're very hard to change, which is part of what we study. And so you don't want to go into that ill-informed, and you also want to go into that with some possibilities for change. But usually in the moment, it's so hard to get the change at all that you don't focus on those like caveats. You focus on the. So that's not really answering your question, especially in terms of being specific. But I feel I came at it backwards. I've come to have more time, slow study, like the slow food movement. I wanted time to be proved wrong, to read another point of view, that kind of thing.
I mean, maybe as a sort of query, have you been in a situation where, there's been a policy that needs to be developed and you've been approached, or you have approached others about doing some research to sort of help guide that process? Does that happen?
Yeah, it happens. I can say briefly maybe around working with the World Trade Organization, where we were trying to understand the rules for agriculture and how they were affecting developing countries. We could see that rich countries had written in what they wanted to protect because they partly politically had to and partly wanted to, and were pushing developing countries to do something else, and that the tools that were in the rules weren't going to work for developing countries. They had much less money. They had to think about it differently. They had far more people in agriculture. They weren't just dealing with 2% of their population. They were dealing with 80% in some cases. And so we were able to talk through that. What are these rules and how do they work? Why do they seem so suitable for the world? And how would you articulate your difference from the defined world, and giving them ways to bring that forward. They needed evidence to be able to do that, and so documenting their agricultural sector, documenting what happened, definitely made a difference. Yeah.
I guess I could use an example because I just returned last night from Colombia in Bogota, which was a very interesting time to be there, of course, with the pending peace and reconciliation agreements. And we were brought actually down to do a technical assessment that has policy relevance in a specific sector that's generated a lot of conflict in Colombia. Of course, what was extremely interesting is that the policy stage was set for peace, and there is an unintended outcome of a no and a country divided. I think it was a very emotional response, and you could see half of the country, literally in tears as this was coming in, and then others just recognizing that in looking at peace building and envisioning a peaceful future for Colombia, there are very different scenarios of how that could play out. And so one approach that we were looking at when we'd originally come in to do basically a strategic environmental assessment for the informal gold economy, so looking at artisanal and small-scale gold actors versus what we typically imagine mining as the big monolithic organizations. That this sector is unique from an international development assistance perspective because it's directly linked to poverty alleviation. But in terms of looking at this thawing period that's happening for the government of Colombia, they really want technical expertise to look at how do you start developing these resources in a sustainable way, and what the approach that we took is a bit of a value of information approach, and that looking at how do you build strong and robust policies. Well, usually it comes from evidence-based decision making, but unlocking information that's very difficult to access. And so part of what the mission we just completed was actually going and being a bit of the honest broker of, we sat down with the FARC and with the guerrillas group that most organizations are unwilling to talk to. And what was very interesting is the theme that we saw emerge from some of this dialogue was actually around the environment. So communities, the FARC and the guerrilla group, as well as the government, actually see environmental cooperation for peace building as a way to move forward. But at the same time, we recognize that there's no broker within that science policy interface. And so what's very interesting, and we'll be exploring more, is that some areas for the last several decades that have been under historic FARC control have actually become islands of conservation. So they have comparatively less deforestation than other areas. And so there's a big question now with this political transition. How can we support evidence-based decision making? And coincidentally, what most people didn't realize is that the FARC are excellent record keepers. They have a huge inventory of information that's never actually been unlocked to support public policy and decision making. And so I hope that looking at Canada's commitment to the peace agreements and the contribution that we can make, is that's part of supporting unlocking some of that information, which of course is not going to be an easy process, but we made some important strides, I think.
So I'm sort of struggling to come up with which example I might choose of something I've kind of, a project where I guess the question is about this kind of research public interest interface. And I guess first of all I'll describe what I do, or what my role is in the air quality and climate change group. I work in a smaller subgroup of this overall group of 25 people. I'm in a group of 5 people, which are focused on climate change, both within the operations of Metro Vancouver and all of its facilities, and then also looking regionally to see if we can develop policies or programs that influence greenhouse gas emissions or improve resiliency to climate change. So I feel very lucky, because I like to be somebody who gets involved with very many different projects and involved with different people doing different things. And so the work I do spans ecosystem carbon and ecosystem resilience work. I mean, working with natural resource management specialists and biologists, through to thinking about how to upgrade equipment in our facilities to make it more efficient and use less energy, through to looking at programs where we engage with residents in our region and try and figure out how to do behavior change in a policy climate which, at least at the provincial level, isn't very interested in sort of significant regulation. So, one example, just to show you something that might be is an interesting kind of collaboration with an academic group. We have these great regional parks and conservation areas which are really unique, and one of them is Burns Bog, which is a great place to visit, but unfortunately most people don't get an opportunity to visit it. It's a conservation area that has limited access to the public. The way you manage a bog really impacts the amount of carbon it sequesters or absorbs, and the amount of methane it produces, and its overall ecosystem health. So there was a really interesting opportunity to say, let's look at not only the ecological health of this conservation area, but let's try and quantify carbon emissions and carbon uptake of this ecosystem. So this is an ongoing collaborative project with folks in the Department of Geography, I think, across the point with other departments. Andreas Christen is the prof that I'm working with most closely on that. We've had some really interesting instrumentation in there, measuring greenhouse gas fluxes, methane release, and CO2 uptake. The outcome of this is quite practical. We're figuring out that the way we manage the water levels in this bog, because it's very much a constrained and managed ecosystem actually impacts how much methane this bog is producing. And methane is a strong, warming gas. So, this is kind of an interesting space that I'm not super comfortable in because I'm not a biologist, I'm not an ecosystem specialist, but I do understand the carbon and the climate angles, and it's turned out to be a very interesting kind of element of the work that I do, and an unexpected one. So I'm happy to talk about other projects, but that's kind of an example of where Metro Vancouver has this asset. They realize, we don't have all the expertise in-house, but we can collaborate with folks who can help us gather information, and then we can make pragmatic decisions that benefit our region or benefit an ecosystem.
Great, thanks. So I just want to get into sort of, talk about your experience. I want to look a little bit at this from the institutional side. You all have worked for some really interesting organizations, and I'm curious the extent to which they have welcomed your ideas and your kind of cross-cutting skill sets with open arms, or the degree to which you've had to really carve out space to do this kind of work. Is there a general sense that this is something these institutions are excited about and cultivating, or is this sort of a little niche area that you all are working in? If you have an idea.
Sure, I could sort of offer something. I mean, I think, we work differently, when we're in an academic space to when we're in an institution that has, it has a history of providing governance. And I'm speaking to my own experience and some extended experience into the way, for example, the province works. And, we learn amazing skills in this forum, in this interdisciplinary forum, where you have a lot of people coming to do their advanced grad degrees with experience from the real world. I mean, we're seeing that, I certainly saw that in the cohort I was studying and working with. And yet the nature of the work that we do, and feel free to tell me you don't think this is the case, but the nature of the work we do is to ask, really compelling and intriguing questions and try and find kind of counterintuitive and, paradigm challenging answers, right? Not that these questions aren't valid or that the answers aren't true. Of course they are. That's the nature of the work that we're doing, and they're also potentially relevant. But there's an element of the work that I do in the institution that I'm in, which is much more about this kind of domain of mundane science, if you kind of know that expression, where there is a good body of evidence out there for something to be done. And, in air quality research, we understand the human health impacts to a pretty good degree of exposure to certain pollutants. And the challenge is, for me, is not always, finding the innovative new research and, really changing things or turning them on their head. Sometimes, that's the case and that's exciting, but often it's the case that you just have to communicate with people who maybe don't understand the body of evidence that's out there, and make slow change that is to the way we do business, that is maybe a little bit less innovative and less exciting than you might imagine it could be. You come into the government space and you think, well, we're doing things this way, this way, and this way. Wouldn't it be great if we totally turned that on its head? But it doesn't work like that in a bigger organization. So it's a matter of, I think, this ability to listen to other people's points of view and really understand where an institution is coming from, and then constant pressure to try and shift that into a better space, if that's possible. I don't know if you have other examples that might be similar.
I think an example of slow change is often when you deal with governments, it can be a lesson in patience, because occasionally the wheels of bureaucracy grind slowly, and I think that the decision making and the consequence of error can be very high for certain decisions that are made. And so one space I think that I have been very interested in sort of deepening the breadth of how research can contribute to international development assistance is looking well beyond the economic determinants of poverty. So I found that traditionally in the international development assistance community, most of the models and many of the assumptions are predicated from economists. Now, I'm not an economist, but when I've dealt with many situations, I think that there are cultural, social, political, environmental, and geographic influences that can strongly determine what certain outcomes from development assistance will look like. But often we only measure them in GDP, or the number of the percentage of a population that lives below a certain threshold in economic terms. But what if you look at Indigenous communities that don't value money in a monetary, modern concept? I think that there are more important ways to look at and really delve into the topic of vulnerability. And so I think that in something that's quite interesting with our new Canadian administration is that over the course of this summer, the Government of Canada has they launched an International Development Assistance Review, which for the first time in over a decade actually got out the crowbar and started digging into what we could be doing better and what Canada should be supporting in terms of its overseas development assistance. And one area that they actually really focused on was bridging the gap between academic institutions to better inform some of those decisions. So again, although some of these changes are slower moving sort of endpoints, I think that being a strong contributor and trying to really be an advocate for why science policy coordination should happen more frequently is part of the work that I've been doing. It is some interesting conversations when you bring, hardline academics with policymakers and practitioners, but I think that that's a really important space to, support usually very polarized opinions, but it's a step definitely in the right direction.
I'll just throw in a few quick things. One is that my experience is that there are different, within the development, non-government organizations at least, there are different cultures of research and policy and its role, and also within different sectors. So the humanitarian world tends to be more operational. It's been very hard to get humanitarian assistance to engage in longer term planning because they deal with people dying right there, right now, and they're always in kind of crisis mode. And so it's not surprising. So that shift to bring in, okay, so what if we invest in infrastructure to create a refugee camp? What does that mean now, 10 years, 20 years, on the side, 40 years later? What will it mean? That's been harder to do. Whereas other areas like gender work has been from the beginning informed by, hey, when you look at this problem from a different lens, it has a very different implication. So you'll find the space for the research overlap is partly cultural, and different places have more time for it. Britain, for some reason, has tons of policy work. All the NGOs, environment, others, have this policy engagement. People go to the European Commission, they talk to government. The US is more bifurcated, it's huge, but there are lots of very big NGOs with almost nobody ever really thinking about policy on board. It's not their problem. Where's the next contract? They evaluate, they respect what they're doing, but they're not asking searching questions about how change happens. Or Canada's a little bit in the middle, but small, I would say, and not every organization is interested in the research. I would say one of the really interesting things to be done, in my opinion, is the knowledge brokering, understanding what you know and then being able to apply it. So if you want the new cutting edge research, I don't think it's in these institutions that you'll find it, but if you enjoy making sense of economics to non-economists or engineering to non-engineers, there's a huge demand for that. And the last thing I'd say is kind of echoing that point Connor made about, usually for policymakers, they want to know it's going to work. They're really not interested in your never tried before idea. Gates might be with a special part of his foundation funding, but governments, especially where they have a political reputation, they want to know they're not going to fall on their face and look like fools. So where has it worked before is really helpful to them. And this space is a great space to say, well, maybe it could work this way. And from what you learn, take it to that space where they're really going to want some hand-holding if they're being asked to change what they're doing.
So I want to follow up on that point. Insight-oriented research and applied work in the public interest, they often seem like they're worlds apart in many ways because they seem to require very different types of skills and expertise. I would like to ask, in your experience working at this interface, what are the particular skills that have been most critical for being successful at that interface and why? And maybe, Kirsten, maybe you could start, because I know your organization is really active in that space.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of some good examples, I suppose. So one area I think that I never thought would suit me so well was actually having quite a strong background in heavy metal chemistry. And why does that matter? Because I can actually I understand the content to a point where if you can distill it and you can communicate it in a palatable way to a community or a policymaker, I think that often what we see is that a policymaker has to make a decision, and so it's call the scientists, and the scientists put, a policy briefing or something together, and then it's sent back to the policymakers. Even if they don't fully understand the information, they still have to make a decision. And so I think that one-way connection or flow of information is something that I see more often than not. So if you can actually take the time to sit and say that there are no stupid questions, this is very important that you understand some of these more technical elements and the consequences they could have for the decisions that you're making. Engaging in that space is very important, and one example of how we were just doing that, actually 2 days ago, was talking to the Ministry of Mines and Energy in Colombia about what resource-efficient and cleaner production could look like for this artisanal and small-scale sector. So that really sits at the edge of innovation, where some governments are willing to take risks because they want to look beyond, and their future in general actually really resides in terms of technological innovation and what kind of steps that you can provide that can be adapted to a developing country context. So resource efficiency not only means that you really need to pay attention to the economic outputs, because when you're dealing with communities that often, in the space that I work, often in this artisanal and small-scale gold mining economy, it's a poverty-driven pursuit. So environmental conservation could be a nice indirect outcome, and they do value, of course, clean water, productive soils, and intact forests. However, if you had to choose between that and feeding your family, it's a very hard decision. So you see a lot of conflicted individuals. But I think that having the opportunity to have a strong technical background and then being able to apply that and at least explain some of the more sciencey elements to communities as well as policymakers is one area I think that the group I'm working with has experienced has been of real value.
Well, I would say you need to have opinions, and you need to be able to say, yeah, sure, on the one hand, on the other, but actually, this is what you want to do. So you need to be able to be comfortable with all of the gray and not present the gray all the time. And I think that's the kind of personality thing. And so partly it's what you enjoy. Do you enjoy the communication? Do you enjoy the idea that this might move forward even in some small, difficult way? Or do you really just want to be able to come at it a different direction and ask another set of questions and run another run, do another load of experiments? And I was invited at one point to be part of a conversation that Canada was hosting with what is now Global Affairs. And they were interested in whether they could get the G8, the sort of group of big 8 economies, to say something about ag subsidies, that we would just eliminate agricultural subsidies. And I was there, working for a U.S. NGO at the time, and it's complicated, take out all that money, the whole structure falls apart, yes, it's terrible, but... And it was my brother who said to me after, don't you think the political impact of a statement from those leaders to say that they were going to end these programs, which have many problems, including big political problems, because they make most developing countries very angry. Don't you think that would have been worth it? And I had to say, yes. Of course, in practice, they would never have eliminated all the subsidies. They don't have the power to do that, and it wouldn't have happened that way. And I failed to sort of see that if we were on the margins of power trying to make a change, that message probably would have been much more important than the practical difficulties and intricacies of all these different agriculture programs. So I think that's it's an extreme example. A lot of the work is in a different scale, but I think there is some of that. Keeping your eye on the prize. What is it you want to see change, and when are you ready to just be quiet about all the caveats to go for it?
That's great. One of the things that I found when I was working on my PhD, and I'm interested to hear if this kind of resonates with you, is that it's a lot of fun to work on a policy-oriented research project and come up with recommendations for policymakers, right, based on your insights that then get produced in a white paper or hopefully an academic paper, and then there's often some efforts to communicate that. But remember that, when you're working on these projects, you're not necessarily sitting in the institution and understanding kind of all of the different competing things that are going on that may support or be a barrier to a policy change. So I was going to say, so trying to describe, a skill that is very important is to be a humble and respectful knowledge broker, kind of to echo some of the words I heard here. And then I thought, okay, no, there's actually another word, a humble and respectful, but opinionated knowledge broker. Like, don't be afraid of, being confident in your knowledge and your opinions. However, recognizing that there are a lot of smart people who have probably a lot more years of experience understanding the process by which decisions are made and the barriers and the issues that need to be overcome before a change happens. So, really taking the time to understand the problem and work with these people who may not necessarily have access to that same fresh, insightful and counterintuitive information that you have, but recognizing that change has to happen through a process and they need to be your ally to make that change happen. So really kind of a key is to try and figure out, who are your allies and what do they know and what are the issues and the barriers that may need to be overcome, and then use the levers at your disposal. Like, don't be somebody who tries to communicate against a misunderstanding if that's not your main lever. Maybe your main lever is convincing a colleague who has more influence in the organization. Something I found in the organization I work in is it likes to be a leader as long as its followers are really close behind and almost leading. So, there's this real balance, and once you understand that and can kind of pitch your ideas, and when I say your ideas, I'm not talking about just my ideas, I'm talking about working in teams with all these diverse skill sets to try and bring change to an organization that is big and a little cumbersome at times. It's to understand that context, that you want to make this leadership role safe, and well supported and not too edgy.
I hope you all won't mind me asking you to speculate a little bit. We're in a room full of very capable people who are quite interested in doing good things with their careers. You all have been working at the interface of research and applied work, public interest for quite some time. And Sophia, you mentioned that this might be an exciting space to be looking into. It might be a growing space. I wonder if you could speculate as to what kind of sectors or what kind of opportunities folks like all of us in the room might think about looking into as we sort of go through our graduate degree and start thinking about work.
Well, we've listed a few, I guess. I mean, there are nonprofits that hire scientists, and I use that term in the biggest sense, all of us. And there are certainly foundations that do that. There are government organizations that do that. There are think tanks, many more in the U.S. than here, that hire people just to do that, a public policy agenda, but they hire academics to do the work because they want that type of rigor. Trying to think of something more offbeat, because I think there probably are some.
I think, I'm thinking of the cohort that I did my grad degree with, and so I'm trying to think of a few people I'm still in touch with and what they're doing. And, there's a few people who have followed the academic path, and those opportunities are not there for everybody, period. There just aren't those positions. But they're also not for everyone in another sense, in that may not be the path that you feel where you feel you can make the most impact in your career. Some of my former colleagues here at IRES are now in the consulting world, where they're using their insightful way of thinking to provide answers to clients who may not expect the sort of answers they're going to be given by this innovative group. And some of them are local. There's also, in the field that I'm in, there's also kind of this kind of clean tech space where folks with a little more technical background or this, this interest in applying emerging technologies can get into, and I think that's pretty exciting. I mean, personally, my most kind of direct experience is what I've experienced, which is working in local government and seeing others work in local government who have PhDs and who have masters from UBC, whether it's SCARP or IRES, and who are being rewarded, sort of pleasantly surprised by the different opportunities that they have. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I hope that my earlier comments don't come across as sort of saying it's all about mundane science and it's less about kind of the innovative. I think that it's been a really continuous period of growth for me, and I think that that's something that, you know, when you're very much in the academic space, it's hard to see into that. It's hard to see into that space where the bureaucracy lies and where there might be opportunities that are interesting. There's definitely a stereotype that folks go into that space and kind of wither and don't have an opportunity to flex their wing feathers and really, you know, make a difference. And I would sort of contradict that opinion. I think that I've learned something to be different to the country, and I'm very pleasantly surprised by that.
I guess one area I would say is that I've noticed in at least my own work is sort of looking at what Canada's contribution or what lessons learned in Canada in terms of being a resource-based economy and what that could hold in terms of supporting the least developed countries, the developing countries and emerging economies, and at least learning from not all of the success stories, also some of the failures, the missteps, and when things go wrong. And I think it's important to, often we want to frame things around positive outcomes, but even when there are negative outcomes, I think that insight can be gleaned from that. It's slightly more uncomfortable, I think. People are usually less willing to talk about some of the potential decision-making that has resulted in either conflict or just negative or adverse impact. I think as well, in general, you know, some of the work that I've seen is thinking outside of the box. When we talk about sustainability and sustainable development, you know, taking a hard look at how development outcomes or certain trajectories can be influenced by certain decisions. So an example of that I'm looking at the moment is, you know, the Trudeau government and actually the global government, government climate is been very invested in the Paris agreements, looking at climate change mitigation and adaptation, and really looking at how as a global community we're going to move forward on this. But often I'm dealing with mineral-based economies, and so even a transition to green growth or looking at a low-carbon economy that could actually have unintended consequences for the demand for base minerals, which after agriculture, mining is becoming, you know, one of the largest contributors to land use and land use change. So there are some important trade-offs when you're considering looking at avenues or solutions for sustainability problems. And so I think it's just being comfortable with asking very hard questions and recognizing that, you know, anyone can identify a problem, but trying to work towards solutions is inherently more complex. But if you can do that, I think it's a rich enterprise within your own work.
I would just throw out private sector as well as a place to work. People who, you know, Nestle, they need water, you know, a long time into the future. And there's some very interesting work that goes on in certain places. Banks to do a lot of forecasting because they want to tell investors where to put their money. It's different things. It's not entirely public policy always, but they actually are spending a lot of time and money on some of these problems, a lot more resources than some of the other places you might work.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to spare you from any more of my questions. And in the last 12 or 13 minutes, I want to turn it over to the audience and see what questions they might have. Any questions?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I'm lucky that I'm in a position where, you know, I need to draw on evidence, and the evidence I choose to draw on is typically published journal articles, and the latest information I can find from the science on that topic, and that's expected of me, and it's understood that I will do that as part of my work. So I feel like not only that, but also continued collaboration with various people in UBC and SFU that's been really fruitful and engaging. And so that's kind of helped me stay fresh. I know that there's maybe there are other positions where that's less of an opportunity. I think, your position is what you make of it. I mean, if you're interested in staying up on the science, I mean, it's, no end of newsletters you can sign up on to give you table of contents alerting in an area that you're interested in and that's relevant. There's also no end of opportunities if you have the time and the interest outside of your professional role, right? So associations you can join or advocacy groups which need people who have this kind of policy science interface experience. And there's a lot of advocacy work that goes on which is not well informed. I mean, how many times have you seen a group advocating for a good cause and then they get something quite wrong in their underlying argument and it weakens their case, right? So if you want to stay engaged and your current role doesn't give you that, well, first of all, see if you can change that role and shift that role over time, because there is usually an opportunity to do so. But then also look for stimulating opportunities to be engaged and make a difference elsewhere.
I guess this is a quick, it's not a long comment, but I guess with looking at withering, it's, I guess, an active decision to not let yourself wither. I think it actually takes a commitment in terms of looking at self-management as well. And I know that when you're in the depths of doing a literature review or preparing for comps or these sorts of things, it seems like that's the only thing that can possibly matter. But I guess it's also just making sure you put yourself in a position where you won't necessarily wither on the vine or burn yourself out, because that is also a bit of a danger.
I was curious about how you manage timelines and
It's a huge challenge, I would say, because Trudeau government comes in, they're going to spend a little bit of time talking to people, but not all that much before they're going to be worrying about the next election. And so the moments you have to make a difference are small, and the best examples in my experience of where the research and policy come together are based on research that's been going on for a long time. So part of the Academy's job seems to me to be thinking about what we're going to need to know a long time hence and being ready for it. So some of the really interesting work that happens in development is time series. What happens over time in a place as the transformation occurs? And you need 30 years to know what happened in 30 years. But if you're deliberate about it and anticipating what you might do with it, then there are going to be moments that you can't predict. There's going to be a hurricane, there's going to be some sort of power failure, there's going to be some, political crisis that's going to create an opportunity for you, and then you're going to want to know who to talk to. You're going to want these alliances that have been across different worlds to bring something forward and say, I have the research, and I have an idea, and this is the moment that we want. But one of the failures often, and I think it happens to PhD students, is that an organization will come and say, you could do your PhD work and help my organization figure out, improved animal welfare for whatever it is. And what that student needs to do for their PhD is not the same as what that organization needs in order to make a case for a policy change. And it's not really a fair proposal. The student will struggle to satisfy the organization. The organization will probably be frustrated. And the PhD is something else. It's a training for something, in my view. And so those matches are less fortunate than finishing or coming to something in your PhD and saying, hey, I bet an organization could really use this insight. This really would make a difference. I've seen it now. And then you're able to go and see if there's an audience for it. But it's more about this work bubbling along and looking for moments of synergy, I think.
There are opportunities to, and that really resonated. There are opportunities, I think, to engage in a short-term way with, for example, local government, but also many other institutions in a sort of an internship role, or for a specific project. I'm thinking of Vancouver's Greenest City Scholars, or Metro Vancouver now has Sustainable Region Scholars in a copycat kind of leadership sort of way. But there are things that you can do. You can take your skills and apply them to a problem that is being raised, and learn from that process of delivering something in 3 months that's, not only really coherent and draws on the latest literature, but is also really useful, that you've shown that you understand the needs of that organization, and they are different from, the academic PhD task, right, which is setting you up. It's contributing to the overall body of knowledge, but it's not necessarily responding to a client, so to speak. So, yeah, I agree with the second one.
I think in my experience, the projects that we work on are directly funded from the Government of Canada, but often they're led by academic leads, and much of the information that's being generated, that's foundational, so basic information as well as frontier knowledge, is generated most of the time by graduate students at the University of British Columbia or in developing countries where we've established partnerships with other academic institutions. And so I think it's a challenge where you don't want to stifle the creative space and academic freedom, and at the same time, there are tensions around timelines, cross-scale interactions of, well, we need this in 6 months, although, maybe you would like to take 18 to actually produce it. And so I think it's a fine balance of making sure that you stand your ground when you know that this is your research and this is your work. And I think that if you have the ability to recognize that sometimes when you produce something for an external client or you're working with an institution, occasionally it can be good enough for their purposes, recognizing within your own trajectory you may take a deeper dive or have the ability to achieve your own personal goals. So that's always, there are tensions between the two, but ensuring that if you are working with, say, a private industry partner or a government, that you have your own convictions about your own research, and occasionally you can have the ability to separate it. This is my contribution to a project, this is my own body of work that I am also deriving benefits from my own personal and professional development.
We probably have time for one more question. Let's do one more. Questions from the faculty? Not one? Well, in that case, I want to thank you so much for sharing your time and experience. It's been really illuminating. Thanks for coming in. East Vancouver, quite a trek. So,
Hi, how's it going?
Well, this week twice, and then I won't be in 2 weeks.
yeah,
Good.
I'm up there from time to time trying to get some funding done, but I
Yeah.
just had a little girl, so I'm not getting out as much as I would.
Oh,
3 months old.
That's exciting.
She didn't last night. She was talking all
Well,
night, and I was just like, I'm not gonna be able to think. But it was good. We had the questions printed.
Yeah. No, it was really
It went well.
exciting,
It's
yeah.
really neat to know about all the work that you all have been doing. It's quite fascinating. I'd like to know more about all of it.
Yeah, and I'm
Yeah,
we're based
I'll
on
look
campus
back.
as
Okay.
well, just over by Forestry.
Okay.
Yeah.
We should talk about climate change adaptation in the Himalayas.
Yeah, that would be great. And what part of Nepal are you working in?
I was
Or
in
is it
Khumbu,
more about?
Mount
Oh,
Everest
okay.
region.
Yeah.
But I don't think I'll be going back there. And I'm actually considering going to the Indian Himalayas this time.
Oh, you are? Okay.
I have some colleagues who have a project
Yeah,
there.
nice to meet you.
Anyways, so, I'm just starting comp, so I have a little bit of time. But I want to make sure I have some good study science. Because Khumbu, I don't know if you've been in there, but there's a pretty heavy tourism footprint,
Yeah.
which kind of
I have.
conflates
Yeah.
confounds the research in some ways, unless you're interested in tourism impacts.
Get around.
No, I know, but then that always makes it a bit hard and a bit more challenging. I would say that the Peru water project we have, as it's sort of ramping up for its second
Oh, yeah.
stage, we're really looking at, what kind of, what is the Peruvian government doing in terms of monitoring glacial retreat and the influence that could have in certain water basins where there are, many competing interests, of course, for water. And that's something that actually I'm meeting with our team later
Great.
this week.
I have a bunch of colleagues who are doing primary glaciology and hydrology work in the Peruvian Andes. So,
Okay.
we should talk.
Yeah, that would be great.
I'm going to be at McGill for the next week and a half, but when I'm back, October and November, I'm kind of moving around, but we should get coffee and talk about what kind of projects you guys have.
Yeah, that would be great. And also, so you're Vanier.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, congratulations, because that's very competitive. And how far are you into your program?
Just started my second year.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And I'm a Lou Scholar as well, so I'm over at the Lou
Oh,
Institute.
nice. All right.
My photos are in the gallery if you get a chance to go over there.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. We actually have we have a Lou event coming up for photography as well soon. Yeah, and I do quite a bit of work with Wade Davis and Momoa. So we're
We need to coordinate.
Yeah,
Because I'm doing
yeah.
a bunch of visual method stuff. I'm just, this can turn off.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we can turn that off now, I suppose.